My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kali Mahorra on Al Mayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak Kali Mahorra, and my audience does too. Kali Mahorra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to Kali Mahorra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing all of Europe. The Chinese leader Mao Zedong once said, "Sometimes the enemy struggles mightily to lift a huge stone, only to drop it on its own feet." On any view, certainly on my view, that's exactly what Europe has done, and North America for that matter, in the economic war they have launched against Russia over the issue of the Ukraine. To call it self-harm would be, I think, an understatement. More like suicide, certainly political suicide, for one after another of Europe's leaders. As I speak, one or two of them are still in place, but they are going down like 9 pins. Draghi, the Prime Minister of Italy, has fallen. The Prime Minister of Albania is about to fall. The Prime Minister of Bulgaria has fallen. Macron has lost his majority. Schulz is looking shaky. Boris Johnson is out of office, and Joe Biden doesn't know even where he is. But wiser councils in the United States and in other chancelleries of Europe already know that the sanctions they have launched are harming themselves far, far more than they are harming Russia. Indeed, an argument can be made that Russia is profiting from the sanctions that have been imposed, not least because where it suits them, the Western powers are lifting the sanctions. Certainly the United States has absolutely no qualms where it has to, like on the space station, where they discovered that without Russian cooperation, they can't even bring their own astronauts home. So space cooperation has been exempted from these sanctions, as have fertilizers. Joe Biden in Saudi Arabia discussed that Saudi Arabia has doubled the amount of its oil imports from Russia since the war in Ukraine started. Talk about selling sand to the Arabs or ice to the Eskimo, I know, but that is what has happened. The reality is that the German economy, the once all-powerful German economy, is in such dire straits now that workers are beginning to spill onto the streets Italian style. And that doesn't happen often in Germany. The Confederation of Engineering Employers in Germany has warned that over the winter, German manufacturing will grind to a halt. Germany has asked its people to have shorter showers, even helpfully advising that people should really just wash under their armpits, their groins, and their feet. I'm not making this up. That's official German government advice, because we don't want people lingering in the showers long enough to wash the rest of themselves. Instead of food banks in Germany, they are making preparation for the opening of warmth banks, formerly known as public libraries in countries like Britain, where when you were cold at home, you could go to a public room and huddle together with others for warmth. This in the most powerful of the European economies. All over the place, even in countries like Czech and Slovakia, like Austria, people are quietly discussing, we're going to have to get out of this bind that we've put ourselves in. I think a fair assumption is that once the occupation, liberation, call it what you like, of the eastern part of Ukraine is complete, Putin and the Russian government will offer a settlement terms to Ukraine and its allies. If they are accepted and sanctions begin to be lifted, there might be hope for us. But if that settlement is rejected, perhaps under US pressure, then we could be in for a long and devastating war on the ground in Ukraine, but also in the economic sphere in Western countries. Anyway, what do I know? I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. I am joined by a panel of distinguished experts, and let me hear what their point of view is. Murad, thanks for joining us. From what I said in the beginning, how do you agree or differ with my analysis?
I mean, it is quite intriguing what's happening in Europe. I was in Paris when we had the resignation of the British Prime Minister. Well, one that I didn't think he acknowledged fully at the time that it was a resignation. And what were the French doing? They were actually nationalising the EDF Energy,
the energy
company,
sector,
and I think that's very telling.
Which owns much of the British energy sector.
Indeed, and I think that's the important and relevant thing, and that's from a Macron government, which is broadly centre-right. And I think whilst the Tories have got caught up in their own internal infighting now about who's going to replace Mr. Johnson, they've lost the art of governing at all of any of these issues. And I think obviously energy and the cost of living is the big issue for all of us in the UK and the rest of Europe, if not the whole world. Europe hasn't come out of this very well, as you've highlighted, but can I just emphasise on the energy and climate change front, it was only recently last year the G7 made major commitments in Glasgow at the COP26 about new commitments. They've actually now reneged on most of those. Germany actually have now gone, well, the German government with the Social Democrats have gone in with the German Greens and are now de-escalating the nuclear power and going for coal, would you believe it? Now, I don't know how.
The government of Germany said that Germans will have to burn wood this year.
It's incredible. And this has obviously come from the Ukraine war and their energy dependency. They're not going to honour their commitments to go for renewable energy, which obviously will mostly be domestically supplied. They've gone for coal. And you've got similar instances with America. Biden came in with commitments to make climate change his main agenda. He's not been able to get his bills to change the energy sector in America, and nor has he been able to, well, and he's also lost power because the Supreme Court now is telling the Environment Protection Agency they can't tell the power stations what they should do to reduce their CO2 emissions. So let's not forget that part of the agenda, and I think Europe is certainly losing a lot of credibility in the rest of the world.
So what should we conclude? That we're governed by idiots, or was this did they know this? Did they go into this with their eyes wide open?
I'm not sure we're being governed at all, particularly in the UK. As I've suggested, they're more concerned about the internal infighting in their party ranks. We're seeing this with who takes over from Mr. Johnson. We've had essentially a leader who's acted presidentially when he was actually Prime Minister. He's been saying that he had the 14 million votes. Well, they didn't actually vote for him directly. They voted for the Tory party, and that's the chaos and mayhem we've got. Indeed. And I think we're going to have this until if we don't have a general election now, I don't know what's going to sort it all out.
Charles Kelly, a writer, you give us first your take on things.
Thanks, George. My take, I don't disagree with anything you've said. The West has definitely made some errors in, perhaps their opening moves in this chess game. They've certainly been outplayed by Putin in this way. But of course, it's not the bureaucrats in the European Union that are suffering. It's not the leaders that are suffering. It's the people that are suffering with these massive increases in fuel. People are suffering, and food banks are going to be very busy this winter in the UK, not just giving out food, but giving out fuel vouchers. And look at parts of the world. I mean, you mentioned leaders falling. Think about Sri Lanka, where it's fallen into chaos there. And
whole country's fallen.
Yeah, and I believe there's going to be hunger in the world because of this. And why did this war start? As I understand it, Putin was worried about NATO forces moving ever closer to Russia, European Union inviting more countries, like recently Ukraine. How does that help the situation to come into the European Union? And he was obviously worried about things, and he said he didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. He wanted a guarantee that they would not join NATO. Now, whether he would have stuck to that agreement or not, I don't know. But
well, of course, the price will be much higher now. The war could have been avoided with that, but now that all this blood and treasure has been expended and all these sanctions are imposed, the asking price for an end to the war will be much higher than it was at the beginning.
yes,
But you're right, on the face of it, the war could have been avoided by a cast iron declaration and treaty that they would stay a neutral country.
yes.
And that they would implement the Minsk II agreements about regional autonomy in just a small part of eastern Ukraine. Now almost all of eastern Ukraine is in the hands of Russia or pro-Russian forces. So I ask you the same question I asked Murad. Are our leaders, therefore, idiots?
I don't think there must be some agenda behind what they're doing, because they can't all be idiots. But it's doing a lot of damage to everybody. I mean, I understand. I mean, Simon Jenkins in The Guardian recently said that if Russia would lift the blockade, under certain conditions, they would lift the blockade and release some of this grain. Whether or not he would stick to that agreement, I don't know. But it's causing hunger and poverty in the world. So something's got to be done. Something's got to give.
Well, of course, Ukraine is only it's a decent sized, but by no means the crucial factor in the supply of grain, number one. Number two, the Russians and the Turks have guaranteed that they will ensure that the grain is exported. It is the mines laid by Zelensky, which he will not remove, that is the barrier to food exports from Ukraine. Dr. Tom Pierce, psychiatrist, heaven knows we need psychiatrists here, and political activist, long-standing friend of the show. Welcome back. Let me go straight to the question I asked both my other guests. Can we conclude, given this self-harm that has been performed, that our leaders are fools or knaves or both?
I think it's a case of gambler's fallacy. They've invested so much in the Ukraine war, they can't pull out now. If they pull out now, they'll look ridiculous. I mean, even more so than they already do. So essentially, they've tied themselves to this rock, and they have to carry on. I mean, as I think you've mentioned, my other guests have mentioned, the whole war in Ukraine, it's not doing anyone any good, at least of all the people in Ukraine. I think in general, by sending more weapons to Ukraine, which is what the EU and the NATO countries and the US are doing, we're actually fueling conflict further, creating more refugees, making it actually harder for a settlement to occur. But the other thing that's worth pointing out is the war didn't start on the 23rd of February. It started about 8 years ago, in 2014, following the coup. And ever since then, the Minsk agreements, Minsk I, Minsk II came up. They could have been implemented by Ukraine with support from France and Germany. Actually, had they been implemented, Ukraine would have been much better off. It would have kept Donetsk and Lugansk, but it would have had to give them extra regional autonomy. But Ukraine would have been intact. There would have been no war, there would be no suffering, there would have been no major refugee crisis. I think the only people who really benefit from this, certainly not Ukrainians, certainly not Europeans, the rest of Europe, the only people who benefit are the US. And I do suspect that actually it's in the US interest for there to be a war in Europe, because they can then help rebuild it with the Marshall Plan, like after World War II. Certainly with Russia and Germany, if Russia and Germany come together and Nord Stream 2 pipeline had been opened, you'd have had a massive bloc, a massive economic bloc that could have been, that could basically stood up to or competed with America and China. I mean, you would have Germany, powerhouse of Europe, Russia, the center for all the natural resources. Had they come together, they would have created a stable, powerful bloc. But the US wouldn't want that.
No, and under successive presidents, Trump tried very hard to stop the Nord Stream 2. Biden has stopped it, and much more besides. The US dollar is massacring the euro, which is an historic low in value, and industrial capacity in European countries is headed towards a winter of real problems. Let's go over to the United States. Professor William Buiter is a former academic economist, chief economist at Citigroup and is currently an independent economic advisor. But previously, he was an original member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, which, trust me, is something to be. Professor, welcome to the show.
You are welcome.
Professor, not long ago it was common to describe the process of globalization as the reduction of the world into a small village. Are we still on that track, or is this disruption permanent?
I think we are seeing the start of a bifurcation, a splitting into two of the global trade, financial, economic environment. One block focused on the US and Western Europe, which includes Japan, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, and another focused on China and Russia. Much of the world will continue to deal with both these power centers, but the days of sort of open-ended globalization of unrestricted offshoring are over.
Europe is tumbling into very serious problems, rising prices, shortages, the danger of a long and cold winter, and the political unrest that is beginning to arise in the Netherlands even, but in Italy and in France and perhaps soon in Germany. Are we going to have to learn to live with this, or is the system we have in some danger from it?
Europe is paying the price for having allowed itself to become overly dependent on Russian fossil fuels, especially gas, natural gas, but also to a lesser extent oil. And it's paying the price for that. I believe they will learn this lesson and that they will wean themselves off dependence on Russian gas and oil, first step. And secondly, they will hopefully, despite the recent backsliding, move towards a greener energy future where fossil fuel sources of energy are going to be a diminishing share of the total and zero, hopefully, by 2050.
Well, there's a real backlash now on the streets of European countries against the effect of these sanctions. Will these European governments have to back down, or will the people back down?
Well, there clearly is a lot of pain at the moment as a result of the sanctions and the war-associated increase in the price of energy and indeed other commodities. But I don't think that Europe is likely to cave in and restore its purchases of Russian fuels while Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine. There will be strange compromises, like the decision to declare certain forms of natural gas to be sustainable, green emissions.
The US dollar is booming against the euro in particular, but also against the pound. Is that going to continue, do you think?
Well, the weakness of the euro and of sterling vis-a-vis the US dollar is not really a function of changing the global currency weight of different currencies. The dollar, the US dollar, is and will remain for the foreseeable future the dominant global currency. What we're seeing is the response to the fact that the Ukraine crisis has hit Europe more harshly, and importantly, that the Fed is acting more aggressively, raising rates by 75 basis points at a time, than the ECB and the Bank of England trying to counter the near double-digit inflation that is the result of this economic crisis. So I think we're seeing the market responding in a predictable and normal way to relative tightening of monetary policy in the US vis-à-vis Europe.
While in North America and in Britain, for that matter, there are no mainstream political voices questioning the policy of economic warfare against Russia, the Western European theatre doesn't look quite like that. Many important voices are beginning to be raised and saying, look, these sanctions are harming not Russia, but us.
Clearly, Europe is more affected than the US because Europe is a net importer of oil and gas. The US is self-sufficient in oil and gas. So yes, consumers, households, users of oil and gas and energy pay the higher prices, but domestic producers also get the gains. In Europe, we pay the higher prices, but the domestic producers get less of the benefits. So there is definitely a greater cost to this war and to the sanctions in Europe. But I do not think that this is likely to lead to a meaningful relaxation of sanctions on Russia. I do think these sanctions are not as effective as we had hoped, because Russia is to a large extent self-sufficient in key goods and services. These sanctions do hurt, and it will, I think, add gradually to the cumulative pressure on Putin.
Finally, do you expect more of the kind of unrest, the Italian, Albanian, Netherlands unrest? Do you expect that to grow?
Probably yes, because we may get a little bit of help from the declining level of oil and gas prices we see globally as a result of increasing production outside Russia, including in the US. But I do think that households, consumers will continue to manifest their discontent at the big hole in their pockets, which has been struck by these rising energy costs. But I don't think this will be sufficient to cause a major change in policy.
Well, the doctor thinks Europe will fight on to the last European for Ukraine. Tom, is this all about a love for Ukraine or a hatred for Russia? I'm genuinely puzzled, because Ukraine, only a couple of years ago, or a decade ago, was widely regarded in European capitals as a corrupt basket case. Nobody wanted Ukraine in the EU. Why is everyone flying the blue and yellow?
George, simply it's virtue signaling. I mean, they still don't want Ukraine in the EU. That's why they're making it so hard. So Ukraine has passed stage one of entering the EU. Now, stage one simply means completing the application form and having it reviewed, which will take years. I mean, Turkey's been waiting for 20 years. Other countries like North Macedonia, Albania have also been waiting. I think the idea of letting Ukraine, or allowing Ukraine to apply to the EU and be a candidate member, is simply a case of it's all for show.
Okay, fair enough, but the inputs, financial and military, from Western countries into Ukraine are eye-watering. Interpol has just warned about the danger of terrorists and criminals driving around Europe with javelins in their boots.
Absolutely, and actually already I've heard that on the dark web, javelins are being sold. The javelins that have been given to the Ukrainian army are already been sold on the dark web. I mean, I can't confirm this, but I've heard that they're being sold for $30,000. Indeed, the whole idea of actually arming Ukraine, it's not to help Ukraine at all, it's simply to fight Russia. Obviously, NATO doesn't want to get into conflict with Russia itself, so the idea is to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. When they're finished with that, they've got Poland and Romania lining up. But certainly, this is not at all about helping Ukrainian people. If they did,
30,000 for a javelin. Don't try that at home. I'll be right back after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but discussing the Russia-Ukraine war, or the NATO-Russia war, and the economic war that North America and Western Europe have launched against Russia in reply. We were talking earlier to the United States. Let's go to Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, where Professor Andrew MacLeod joins us.
A pleasure, George.
Professor, there are big things happening in Europe. No wonder you're in Dubai. The economies are crashing, the people are rising, the political leaders are tumbling. What's going on?
There's a lot going on at the moment. Of course, there's a lot of the inconsistencies and uncertainties relating to the Ukraine war and what that means for each of the economies, availability for gas, other natural resources, plus the unfair burden or the unequal burden that the different countries are sharing around the refugees coming out of Ukraine. So there's quite a lot going on at the moment, plus normal summer fantasies that some politicians have, plus changing leaders. So there's an enormous amount happening in Europe. It's very uncertain times.
Britain and Europe have followed the old man wherever he wanted to go. Only those of a certain age will remember that Bing Crosby song. Look it up. But the question is, are the people going to go along that road indefinitely?
Well, they're paying a big price. I mean, what the price that the Germans are paying, for example, is they cozied up to Russia for a long time, became very reliant upon Russian natural gas. And now we're finding that that supply has a very strong string attached to it. And the Russians so-called repairing the Nord Stream pipeline is a real shock to the Germans to realize they're not as energy secure as they thought. That's why they're now bringing a lot of the coal-fired power stations out of mothballs, because they've got to somehow make up for the drop in Russian gas, or the perceived drop in Russian gas, or once they get their coal-fired power stations back open again, they can cut off Russian gas themselves and stop paying the money. So what we're seeing is a realignment and a refragmentation, or the reversal of globalization, that now we're putting Russia in the bad boy corner. We've got to pay to do that. But all of this, let's cut the rubbish here. All of this is in preparation to potentially put China in the bad boy corner if China does in Taiwan what Western powers don't want China to do in Taiwan.
So did these leaders not foresee what the impact of their own sanctions would be? If not, are they fools?
No, I don't think that's fair. I think the Europeans saw the effect of the sanctions. It's just that if you went back 2 or 3 years, they would never have anticipated a circumstance in which the sanctions would have been applied. No one would have anticipated Russia going into Ukraine in the way that they did, and that Americans and Europeans wanting to put sanctions on in place. If they had anticipated that, they would have handled Crimea very differently. They would have handled Syria very differently, and they wouldn't find themselves in the position now where they're having to impose sanctions on Russia, but at a much higher cost to themselves, because they thought the globalization and the linkage of Russia into the global economy was an irreversible event. Turns out it's not irreversible at all.
Seems like only yesterday when all the world leaders, although Putin and President Xi didn't turn up to the COP26 in Glasgow, were crying tears of either joy or sadness that they hadn't gone farther in the transformation towards greenery that they were all committing themselves to. Now all that's in reverse. Coal mines are reopening. The Germans are threatening to chop down the trees and burn the wood to get them through a cold winter. What's going on here?
I think a lot of people are being confronted with the fact that foreign policy is not easy. And it's nice to make very simple statements like, we want green energy. Well, green energy is tied up with geopolitics and everything is complicated. The same people that will be promoting green energy, I would suspect, will be opposing Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, the consequence of opposing Russia's war in Ukraine is either a drastic reduction of the use of electricity and energy in Germany, particularly through the next winter, or reopening coal-fired power stations. Which one do you want? And a lot of people are going to be finding themselves in very difficult positions where the golden rule for leadership. And the golden rule for international affairs isn't that you're choosing between a good option and a bad option. You've got competing bad options, and you've got to determine which is the least bad. Cozy up to Russia and keep their gas, or sanction them and turn on the coal-fired power station. Up to you to judge.
So what do you predict, Professor? Are we in for a long hot summer and a turbulent winter on the streets of Europe?
Well, an uprising in Netherlands is when someone puts their bicycle in the wrong place. I mean, it's a very, very calm country. But when economic challenges come up, societies have started to be tested. We see this in the United States particularly, and it's going to be a challenging time over the next 18, 24, 36 months. Not many people know what it's like to live through a long-term recession. People, George, your age and mine, we remember the 1970s, we remember the 1980s, and in Australia, the 1993, the recession we had to have. I came out of university in one of our deepest, in fact, our last recession until COVID. So it's going to be a challenge for a whole lot of people who are any younger than 40 to really think, what does rising interest rates and what does a recession actually mean? And what are we trying to do at the moment in bringing inflation under control? You're decreasing economic activity, i.e. you're going backwards. You're wanting to put pressure on people to stop spending. So no, you can't have your coffee. No, you can't have your brunch. No, you can't have these things. These are challenges that the younger generation has not been confronted with on a wide scale. The challenge that then comes is discontent grows, and how do governments control that discontent? And I joked before that Netherlands are a revolution as a country where a bicycle is parked in the wrong place. They actually might find that their society is threatened in a way it hasn't been threatened for a few decades.
What about Britain, the mother country, as you once described it? The political crisis here, on top of the economic crisis, is considerable, isn't it? How secure are the British political class in your view?
Not everyone's going to agree with what I say. You know, COVID has hidden a lot of the costs of Brexit. What's coming out to confront us all now is there's a lot of hidden costs of Brexit. Migrant workers are not coming to be able to pick food in fields. There's challenge for staffing. Capital flows have been restricted, and this magic, you know, we'll re-engage with the Commonwealth. It'll replace the European Union. That's coming out to be fanciful. And as someone said to me around the Brexit debate, they said, well, Brexit means that Britain has changed from the smallest of the big powers to the biggest of the medium powers. And when you look on a long frame, actually, this is the last period of any remnants of the British colonial empire. We see the Commonwealth moving beyond Britain. There are now members of the Commonwealth that weren't even British colonies. Australia, Canada have moved well past Britain for a long time. There's not much left. So Britain has removed itself from Europe, and to look around to see what it's got left, and it's an empty cupboard. And the costs of the last 2 or 3 years of that empty cupboard have been hidden by the COVID pandemic. And now we're just seeing, coming through this leadership crisis in the Conservative Party, who is actually coming up to promote a bold, realistic vision for Britain, as opposed to a fanciful, we'll be an empire and we'll be able to cut taxes and we'll show those Europeans. Come on, you know, Britain, wake up.
Charles, I'm thinking of Oscar Wilde on the death scene in Little Nell. When he said you'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh, as they pronounce the death of globalism, of globalization. I'm singing hallelujah. Are you?
I guess in one way, yes. I mean, we keep talking about this, we keep hearing about this global reset, and things are going to be reset with central bank digital currencies, the death of the dollar, which hasn't happened. We've got inflation now, but I don't think it's all down to the war. What we've done is print so much money with this quantitative easing, shutting down the economy, printing all this, giving people a lot of money to stay at home, and now we're paying the price for it. And I think one of the problems the government has is that if they put up interest rates to stop spending, they're going to have to pay billions more in interest on their own borrowing. So they're between a rock and a hard place. Like your previous speaker said, I have actually lived through several recessions, so I do know what it's like. And it seems to me like we're heading into maybe a long recession, maybe even a depression. But then you never know what the central banks are going to do. I don't
He
agree with.
described the recession, though, in ways that you and I don't remember it, that you have to go without a coffee or a brunch. We're talking about wage offers that are actually wage cuts, substantial wage cuts with inflation at 10%. We're talking about mass unemployment. We're talking about the inability of the state to keep basic things for everyday citizens alive. That produces political responses. I'm not sure he's right about the Netherlands and bicycles, by the way. The farmers in the Netherlands look pretty militant to me.
Yeah, he's trivialized that.
He might be right about the British, although, to continue the metaphor, you never know when the last straw will be with British patience. He seemed, I suppose I'm saying, quite sanguine that our system will ride out whatever this recession brings. Do you agree?
I think so, yeah. And he said that we're claiming that we're going to reinvent the British Empire. That's not what we've said at all. And in fact, many surveys predict that Britain will come out of this quite strongly. So I think he's been a bit pessimistic over Britain's future. Yes, there will be problems, but I think that Britain will survive and we'll come out of this. We'll reinvent ourselves. We've got a lot of talent in Britain, so let's be a bit positive about Britain. There are a lot of young talent, a lot of young new industries coming through, and I still have confidence in Britain, even though I think that we are going into a recession and perhaps even a longer term recession.
Murad, your father was a great figure, a great man, a man of political importance, came from the Commonwealth. When you look now at what happened in Sri Lanka, do you fear that that might happen in Pakistan, it might happen in Bangladesh, could even happen in India?
I think it's happening already in Pakistan, quite honestly, with the whole affair around Imran Khan being deposed by effectively the Pakistani army. And it does touch a nerve without any doubts at all. In India, quite interestingly, it's interesting how they've responded to the economic sanctions. You know, the Soviet Union and now Russia has been always a great ally for them.
Of India, yes.
And that hasn't been forgotten by the Indians, actually. It's not just supplying them with the heavy arms that they've traditionally had from the Soviet Union, but actually when you know, important interventions like the Indians made during the Bangladesh Liberation War, the only place they got support from was the Soviet Union. So they haven't forgotten that. They've actually found ways around the economic sanctions. They're still buying the oil from Russia using not dollars but the yuan. Now you think about that. I think we've come into a world where it's going to be multipolar. It's going to be China and America as two economic powerhouses, and in some ways what we're going to end up in the Ukraine, I suspect, is going to be not dissimilar to the mess that we had at the end of the Korean War, where the line was drawn. But you only have to go to the border of North and South Korea to see the extent of armaments that we're going to have. And you know, European powers are going to be in decline. I mean, it's relative. You know, Britain could have boasted to my father that we will take you in as the mother country. That's no longer possible. And if anything, we're trying to send them all to Rwanda. And I'm just confused why we ever did the deal with Rwanda, and they're now members of the Commonwealth.
Rwanda and Mozambique are members of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I don't understand that at all.
None of them speak a word of English or ever had any connection to us. Dr. Tom, it came up several times in the course that there's going to be two blocks in the world. What has been missed is that the bloc around China and Russia look a lot more promising and hence growing. Even Saudi Arabia talking about joining the BRICS, Argentina, Turkey and others already beginning to do so. Than the Western pro-US bloc looks, because as we are discovering now, paying £10 a gallon for petrol, with food prices escalating, shortages multiplying, and that's in a country like Britain, which was not dependent on Russian oil and gas and fertilizer and so on. European countries much more dependent. The sun is rising in the east rather than the west.
Indeed, I agree. And I think I agree with Charles as well. I think although Britain, we are going to get hit hard, we're not going to get hit as hard as mainland Europe. So I do agree with that. I think, George, as well, you're right, actually. Because of the war, Russia's now turned towards China rather than it's turned away from the West. It's now, which I think that relationship may be irreparable, possibly. I mean, the G7 nations talk about isolating Russia, but actually Russia, China and India have more than half the world's population combined. So actually it's the G7 and Western Europe that are being isolated.
Look, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which nobody in Britain even knows exists, contains well over half the people of the world and well over half the wealth of the world. And that's only going to grow. Because China's already the biggest manufacturing power on the earth. Russia is the biggest treasure trove of natural resources, particularly energy, but not only energy. What have they got in Luxembourg or Portugal? What is their economy based on?
Well, exactly, yeah. This is why I think for Europe it's going to be tough times ahead. I think the Europeans, the sanctions on Russia are actually harming Europe far more than they are Russia, as you mentioned earlier on. It certainly goes well beyond self-harming behaviour. And I think the problem is they've kind of got themselves into a cul-de-sac now. It's now very hard to pull out.
Look, you're a psychiatrist, so I'm going to press you on this. And I know you can't professionally comment on anyone's individual mental health, but I'm wondering if a Western world led by Joe Biden, who shows all the signs, not just of decline, but virtual collapse.
Dementia.
Yeah, I didn't want to use that dread word, especially to a psychiatrist, but how wise is it for the rest of us to be following this doddering old man?
I don't think Joe Biden's going to be around for much longer. Let's see what the midterms show. The midterms in America are coming up in November. By all accounts, the American people are not happy that the inflation is going up, gas prices are going up, so the standards of living are falling. I think the Democrats are going to get hit pretty hard. After that, Joe Biden may be too much of a liability. However, the other alternative is that Kamala Harris may step up.
Yeah, her ratings are even lower than his. Charles?
Could I just add something about China? I mean, China's got a lot of internal problems at the moment as well. So things are not as rosy as we think in China. Recently, 4 regional banks failed to give customers their money. They couldn't get money out of the till from regional banks, and the government had to step in. We've got a lot of property companies like Evergrande collapsing. They're failing to meet their commitments on their bonds. So I do wonder what's happening in China, whether it's and of course they've locked down at the moment, haven't they? They've locked down all the manufacturing. But India, now its population has reached the level of China. India, I think, maybe is coming up as a major power as well. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in this economic reset, whether the dollar loses its status as the world reserve currency in the future. Russia, as you said, has got all these resources. They've also got so much oil and gold and resources that the West needs. So I don't know how they can carry on just thinking that they can isolate Russia. Usually when you put sanctions on the country, you put it on a country like Iran because it doesn't affect you, does it? If you put sanctions on Iran, we can live with those. But they've just miscalculated greatly by trying to force Russia into pulling out of a war by imposing sanctions. They could have done it in a much more subtle way. They could have imposed some financial sanctions, but said, let's keep the oil and gas flowing. They could have moved more cautiously.
Or they could have forced Ukraine to avoid the war altogether by living up to its obligations under the Minsk II agreements. Murad, I know you're no longer the chairman of the Stop the War, but you're very close to the organization. How does your side of politics think this is all going to end?
Well, I think I suggested earlier what I think is going to happen in Ukraine. We're going to have not just
North and South Korea, but which is going to be North and which is going to be
True.
South?
That is not something I'm as informed as I should be. But look, we shouldn't forget the extent of militarization we've had. I mean, this we're talking about it's a trillion, several $trillion economy, and the industrial military complex, something that Eisenhower, of all people, suggested we warned us about, and its influence in this is undoubtedly very clear. I'm struck by the comments about arms are being given to Ukraine, but they're going to have to pay for it, and I think that shouldn't be lost.
They won't be able to pay for it.
Well,
if Western Ukraine becomes a rump state, with most of almost all of the industry and most of the agriculture in the eastern Ukrainian state, that's going to leave Western Ukraine rather like Kosovo, just a dependency.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. But yeah, I mean, going back to the Minsk agreement is essentially what I think both parties will have to be going back to. And I'm just intrigued. There's one person's views I would be very interested to know, and I don't think many people have been going to him because he's not actually very popular in Russia, Mikhail Gorbachev. In some ways, he was around doing the grand deals with the West, which actually the Russians always condemned him for. Because they felt they had a come down as a result of their status. He's still around, and he can at least comment on what was the understanding with NATO at the time.
He has said so.
He has said that.
Yeah, and of course James Baker wrote helpfully in his memoirs exactly what they agreed with Gorbachev. They can't now pulp these books, and Baker was the man that did the deal. Tom, where does it all end, viewed from your standpoint?
I think what's going to happen is standard of living is going to get worse for Europeans. Well, I think for all of us, but I think especially for Western Europeans and for mainland Europeans and for the Americans as well. Though I think in particular, countries like Germany may have to shut down industrially. I mean, already German industries have already said, look, we haven't got enough, we can't afford the gas to run our enterprises. If Germany deindustrializes, that's going to be bad news for Germany and the rest of Europe. I think I agree with Murad. What's going to happen is there's going to be a border, like a 35th parallel in North South Korea. There's going to be a border probably between West and East Ukraine. Where that border is going to be, I don't know. I think if the West doesn't find a way, I think if the West and Russia don't find a way out of the conflict, that border will be closer to Poland than it would otherwise be.
I originally thought it would be on the river Dnieper, but you've got Moldova, Transnistria as a growing issue. You've got the Kaliningrad enclave as an issue. It could be that Ukraine will be a province of Poland.
Well, I think actually that's already been talked about. The Polish government have already talked about subtly about incorporating Western Ukraine. They've done it in such a way, they've done it like this basically. Polish and Ukrainian governments have talked about giving each other citizens special status. So the Polish citizens have special status in Ukraine and vice versa. To the extent even where they said that Polish judges will be able to rule, have some sort of legal ruling, be able to implement legal rulings in Western Ukraine. Effectively, it's a way of sort of, I mean, Western Ukraine used to be part of Poland historically, so it's a way of sort of the Polish government trying to reincorporate their regions. And Hungary has
might call it an Anschluss, though that would be perhaps.
And Hungary too, actually. Yeah, I mean, Hungary's also said even a couple of days ago that if they need be, because there's a lot of Hungarians who live in southwest Ukraine, have said if our citizens are threatened, we may have to intervene.
Yes, the Carpathian question may come back to haunt us. It's funny how nothing ever really changes. We might have had this discussion, though not on the wonderful Al Mayadeen television network, 100 years or more ago. Questions that were thought long settled are indeed beginning to open. The big question is, for me, will Western governments be able to keep their populations quiet during the suffering being imposed on them by their own governments in defense of the territorial integrity of Ukraine? After all, territorial integrity didn't mean much to those very same governments when it came to the wars, invasions, and occupations, not just of the last 25 years, but of the last 75 years and more. Big questions. We try to provide the answers here on Kalimahora, where everyone has their say. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night.